Imagine fighting in a city where the enemy does not show up on radar, does not advance in columns, does not shout orders. He is simply there, mixed in among civilians, inside abandoned buildings, sometimes even wearing regular clothes to avoid identification, a clear war crime. In Pokrovsk, the so-called ghost soldiers have appeared, small Russian teams infiltrating the city center to attack from within while the main forces press from the outside. Ukraine's response? A brutal order: find and destroy. What is happening now inside Pokrovsk is not a battle. It is a hunt. And when we talk about a hunt, this is where the story changes scale. Because Russia realized that its old methods, those tank columns advancing in a line, explosions everywhere, armored vehicles being destroyed one after another, simply did not work anymore in Pokrovsk. The cost was absurd. Every advance turned into a graveyard of T-72s, BMPs and support vehicles. That was when Moscow ditched shock for camouflage. What Ukrainian soldiers themselves began calling ant-infiltration was born. No large attacks, no full battalions pushing the line. Now it was pairs, sometimes trios, moving through the urban center like shadows. They advance slowly, building by building, hallway by hallway. They make no noise, kick up no dust, leave no trail. It is the Russian version of a microscopic attack. Small, multiple, and extremely difficult to detect. And the element that turns this into an almost invisible threat is the weather. Pokrovsk, especially in the morning, gets covered in dense fog. Visibility drops to just a few meters, and it is exactly under this grey veil that the infiltrators blend in, suddenly appearing in building entrances, crossing streets as silhouettes, and disappearing before a drone can even lock focus. But the most critical and most dangerous point is that some of these groups stopped wearing uniforms. Yes, soldiers dressed as civilians, carrying hidden weapons, walking the streets as if they were local residents. This has a name: perfidy. And it is not just unethical, it is a war crime. Because when a fighter disguises himself as a civilian, he destroys the line that separates an innocent person from a legitimate military target. And that is exactly the Russian objective. Create hesitation. Make the Ukrainian soldier think twice before shooting. Force doubt, fear of hitting civilians, and by doing so, gain precious seconds inside the city. But this strategy, smart as it looks on paper, created a side effect Moscow never expected. It was precisely this Russian perfidy, this attempt to blend in among civilians, that triggered the most aggressive response Ukraine has ever applied inside Pokrovsk. Once it became clear that ghost soldiers were scattered throughout the buildings, the tone of the orders changed. This was no longer defense, it was a hunt. And the hunt began with the arrival of the units Russia least wanted to face in an urban environment. The 425th Separate Assault Battalion, Skala, specialists in close-quarters combat, entered the city center with a direct objective: sweep every block. Alongside them came teams from the air assault forces, trained to operate in dense areas and improvise approach routes where no vehicle can enter. There is no glamour in Pokrovsk now. It is door-to-door fighting, stairway by stairway, with engagements just a few meters apart. Ukrainian troops enter buildings that look empty and find Russians hiding in bathrooms, basements, shattered balconies, and even inside collapsed walls. It is pure CQB, with grenades, flashlights, thermal cameras, and a cadence of movement trained to leave no openings. But the element that turned the game around was not human. It was electronic. Before any team climbs a staircase, a reconnaissance drone, one of those small, almost silent ones, slips through a broken window and scans the interior. It picks up movement, body heat, strange shadows, even dust disturbances on the floor that give away a hiding spot. It is the radar of the operation, and when the drone identifies something, the most feared instrument of this war comes into play: the FPVs. These smaller drones, carrying compact warheads, fly through windows, narrow hallways, and half-open doors. They literally search for the corner where someone is breathing. For Russia, there is no real defense against this. If an FPV enters the building, it will find the target. The result of this combination was devastating. In November alone, in the center of Pokrovsk, 388 infiltrated Russian soldiers were killed. That does not include those captured or wounded, only confirmed dead within the urban radius of the clearing operations. It is a number that shows the direct effectiveness of the Ukrainian strategy. Every Russian attempt to infiltrate invisible teams is ending in losses that Moscow simply cannot replace at the same pace. At this point, despite the enemy losses, the inevitable question remains: why does Ukraine keep fighting for a city that is almost encircled? The answer has nothing to do with holding buildings, streets, or districts, and everything to do with military math. Pokrovsk is no longer a city. It is a meat grinder, deliberately constructed, where every Russian advance costs more than Moscow can afford. Ukraine's strategy is not to defend every corner forever. It is to turn every corner into a sentence. To understand this, just look at what is happening on the battlefield. Every Russian infiltrator killed inside the city is not just an isolated casualty. It is one fighter who will not be present in the main assault Russia is preparing outside. It is fewer hands to push trenches, fewer trained tank operators, fewer artillerymen, fewer experienced sergeants. And that matters because Russia may have numbers, but it does not have qualified replacements at the same pace. Pokrovsk has become a filter. The Russians throw their most experienced units in to try to stabilize the urban front, and Ukraine does the exact opposite. It pulls those units into the chaos, where drones can hunt, CQB can neutralize, and Russia's numerical advantage disappears. And there is more. Part of the destruction you see in the city is not just a consequence of the fighting. It is intentional. Buildings that could serve as shelter for infiltrators are demolished, easy access areas are blocked, corridors that once allowed silent movement are now reduced to rubble. It is total terrain denial. If a location can protect the enemy, it ceases to exist. This forces Moscow to advance through open ground, under drones, under sensors, under ambushes, all while Ukraine controls the tempo. And that is why, even while losing parts of the city, Kiev is buying time and draining Russian power at a rate the Kremlin cannot replenish. And it is precisely when Russia believes it is about to break Pokrovsk that reality flips completely on its head. Before the war, and even through the first months of 2024, Pokrovsk was one of Ukraine's biggest logistical hubs in Donetsk. Everything flowed through it: ammunition, fuel, medical evacuation, reinforcements, rail routes, coordination centers. Controlling Pokrovsk meant controlling the gateway to a large portion of the Eastern Front. But Kiev did something Moscow never expected. It killed the city's logistical value before it could be taken. With constant attacks and infiltrations happening inside the urban perimeter, Ukraine reorganized its entire supply network. Routes were moved dozens of kilometers west, depots were redistributed, and logistical corridors were reshaped to avoid total dependence on the old hub. The result? Pokrovsk, from an operational standpoint, is no longer indispensable. And this changes the entire dynamic of the battle, because while the logistical value collapsed, the political and symbolic value of the city skyrocketed, especially for Putin. For the Kremlin, Pokrovsk is not just a dot on the map. It is the narrative of opening the door to Donetsk. It is the trophy to show victory to the Russian public. It is the symbol that the advance continues. Moscow needs this victory more than Pokrovsk actually matters. And in this vacuum between propaganda and reality, a curious pattern emerges. Russian military bloggers spend days declaring that Pokrovsk has fallen, that the center is under control, that flags have been raised. But all it takes is geolocating the videos, checking shadows, buildings, blocks, to see that heavy fighting is still happening exactly in the area they claim to have captured. In other words, Russia is trapped in an urban maze that no longer offers military advantage. And it is losing men to seize a city that no longer guarantees anything in logistical terms. And this is where we reach the most uncomfortable and perhaps the most decisive point of this battle. Ukraine is vastly outnumbered in Pokrovsk. In that specific sector, the ratio reaches 8-1. For every Ukrainian soldier, there are 8 Russians trying to crush the front through sheer quantity. And this creates a political dilemma inside Kyiv. Zelensky still hesitates to lower the recruitment age, a decision that would have massive social impact and could trigger internal strain at a critical moment. In other words, there is a human limit to how far Ukraine can expand its ranks. But it was precisely from this limitation that the battlefield's most important innovation emerged. With Pokrovsk's routes saturated by drones, snipers, and infiltrations, moving trucks or logistics teams became practically suicidal. The solution? Ground robots. Small, discreet, electric, silent. UGVs moving through rubble, destroyed alleys, and narrow corridors where no vehicle could possibly pass. These machines carry ammunition, food, batteries, water bottles, medical kits, everything a platoon in the city center needs to keep fighting. And they do it without risking human lives. Today, in certain areas of Pokrovsk, up to 90% of logistics is handled by robots. It is a percentage so high it changes troop behavior. Soldiers who once had to cross streets under fire now simply wait for the UGV to arrive with what they need. It is war ceasing to be just human versus human, and becoming machines versus human waves. On one side, Russia is betting on the Soviet model: mass, volume, quantity, brute force attrition. On the other, Ukraine is betting on sensors, drones, elite microteams, and robotic logistics. Pokrovsk has become the laboratory of this transformation, a living prototype of what the future of warfare may look like, where every Russian advance is met not by more soldiers, but by machines operated from kilometers away. In the end, Pokrovsk will probably fall. The front line is under pressure, the city is partially isolated, and Ukraine does not intend to sacrifice its entire force for a point that has already lost its original logistical function. But that does not mean defeat. It means Pokrovsk fulfilled its role. The city was turned into a meticulously built trap, a meat grinder that drained Russian elite units, destroyed hundreds of infiltrators, and delayed Moscow's advance for weeks. Russia may eventually raise a flag over the ruins, but the price paid for it will be remembered as one of the highest of the entire campaign. And the most uncomfortable truth of this battle is simple. If not for drones, sensors, and robots, Ukraine would already have been swallowed by Russia's numerical superiority. These machines, from $400 to $4,000, are carrying the weight of attacks that once required entire battalions. It is the future arriving earlier than expected, driven by necessity and survival. And now I want to hear from you. Should the use of robots and drones become the standard for the wars of the future? Or can this spiral out of control? And if Pokrovsk showed how the war is turning into a duel between technology and sheer human mass, the next chapter is even more bizarre. Russia is putting literally zombie tanks on the front, vehicles patched together, improvised, recycled to the absolute limit, and sent straight into the crossfire. If you want to understand why these tanks exist, what they reveal about Russia's industrial collapse, and how Ukraine is dealing with this new mechanical Frankenstein, click the video on your screen and come with me. And do not forget to subscribe to the Military Ground. See you there.